Imagine waking up to a world on the edge of deeper chaos, where one decision after another pushes powerful nations closer to the brink. That's exactly where we find ourselves right now in the Middle East, and few voices cut through the noise with more clarity than Colonel Douglas Macgregor. In this conversation, he pulls back the curtain on what's really happening behind the headlines involving Iran, Israel, the United States, and President Trump. The situation boils down to this. Israeli leaders presented a picture that didn't match reality, and President Trump chose to accept it. Now he's trapped in a difficult spot. He cannot admit that the approach has fallen short, so we hear the same familiar claims repeated that Iran's Air Force and Navy have been wiped out. But the truth is simpler. Iran hasn't operated a meaningful Air Force since many of its skilled pilots left years ago. There was little to destroy there. Its Navy consisted of 7 aging frigates, which were straightforward targets, along with swarms of small boats, unmanned surface vessels, and submersibles. Many of those remain untouched and hidden in protected sites, ready to deploy at any moment. This pattern echoes past conflicts. Think back to Desert Storm, when officials stood up and listed hundreds of tanks and artillery pieces supposedly destroyed. Later reviews showed many of those numbers were inflated, and even the accurate ones didn't force the enemy to surrender or withdraw. Something similar is unfolding with Iran today. For over 20 years, Iran has prepared for exactly this kind of pressure. It has constructed vast underground facilities that shield critical assets. Surface damage looks dramatic in videos, but it has done little to slow their missile launches across short, medium, and long ranges, including ballistic systems. Thousands of drones and unmanned platforms appear to remain available. There's no sign that ordinary Iranians are starving or that society is collapsing. If anything, the external pressure has pulled Iranian communities closer together. So the big question remains, what comes next, especially with talk of blockades and ceasefires? The blockade, in my view, is not nearly as decisive as some claim. It feels more like part of a temporary pause than a true strategy. Ceasefires in this conflict seem designed mainly for both sides to restock supplies, repair equipment, refuel, and rearm. Iran has received support in these areas from Russia and China, enough to offset many reported losses, particularly from Chinese assistance in recent days. President Trump often fills the gap between expectations and outcomes by painting a brighter picture than exists. His public statements about China promising to halt weapons shipments and expressing affection for him come across as more theater than substance. During recent discussions, Vice President J.D. Vance stepped out multiple times, apparently updating Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu on progress. Meanwhile, figures like Jared Kushner and others close to Trump, wealthy individuals with strong ties to Israeli interests but limited formal diplomatic experience, have taken on roles representing American positions. When you step back and connect these pieces, it becomes clear that President Trump sees only one remaining path, a massive effort to break Iran completely. He appears to believe that total destruction would shatter Iranian society and force compliance with a list of demands that originate primarily from Israel. Those demands start with ending all uranium enrichment and surrendering inspection rights that would strip away Iranian sovereignty. Next comes dismantling much of the ballistic missile arsenal, which Israel and the United States view as a permanent threat. Finally, Iran would have to abandon support for its regional partners. Tehran has rejected these terms outright. The lesson Iran has drawn from this conflict is straightforward. Without nuclear capabilities, a nation remains vulnerable to attack by powers that possess them. Even though Israel has absorbed serious damage, more than many reports acknowledge, and large numbers of its citizens have left the country seeking safety, the pause we are in exists only to prepare for the next round. That ceasefire is scheduled to end soon, and many expect an intense new bombing and missile campaign to follow, described by some as the largest yet attempted. Yet history and current preparations suggest this too will fall short of forcing surrender. Iran will almost certainly keep launching missiles in response. The real test will arrive when the limits of air and missile power become obvious. Can President Trump then step back and declare the mission accomplished? For him personally, that might be tempting given his long-standing style. but politically and strategically, it could prove impossible. Critics would argue that leaving would hand control of the Persian Gulf to adversaries and leave key waterways exposed. Before this conflict began, oil flowed smoothly. Global supply chains for plastics, fertilizers, electronics components, and countless other products ran without major interruption. Now those systems face real strain. Iran still has options for exporting oil through overland pipelines, connections to the Caspian Sea, and rail networks. These routes allow continued shipments, especially toward China, even if volumes vary. China holds a deep interest in stable energy flows. Leaders in Beijing may look at the current instability and see risks of broader escalation, perhaps even involving Taiwan. Recent talks between Taiwanese officials and Chinese leadership suggest efforts to avoid immediate conflict there, but the distraction in the Gulf could shift calculations. Russia, meanwhile, has gained significant profits from higher energy prices and continues strengthening ties with China, promising expanded supplies. We also see Russian forces building up in Ukraine along key directions, raising the possibility of renewed major offensives there. These separate crises could converge in ways that compound problems for the United States. This interconnected picture represents a serious strategic setback so far. After several weeks of operations, no major military goals have been secured. Turning back to the question of American ground forces, excitement often focuses on troop deployments. Yet the units sent to the region are mostly light infantry-capable soldiers, but organized for missions that have evolved dramatically over recent decades. Large airborne formations remain on standby despite lessons from past conflicts showing their vulnerability. During the 1991 Gulf War, even experienced commanders rejected risky parachute assaults, choosing safer transport instead. Similar caution applied to proposed marine landings. Ideas about seizing islands in the Persian Gulf to control shipping lanes overlooked practical realities. Insurance companies like Lloyd's of London would refuse coverage for vessels in active war zones, regardless of who holds a few islands. Defending such positions against precise missiles and drone swarms would prove extremely difficult. President Trump does not seem ready to accept failure. That points toward one more large-scale attempt to overwhelm Iran through air and missile strikes. After several days of intense operations, however, Iranian responses are likely to continue. At that stage, discussions inside the administration may shift toward finding an exit. Any smart disengagement would avoid further wasteful bombing. Instead, it would recognize that military power alone cannot solve this. The wiser path involves calling for an international conference, bringing together major and regional powers to stabilize energy flows, manage the Strait of Hormuz, and address underlying tensions. Precedents exist for shared waterway management, such as the long successful arrangement for the Bosphorus Strait under Turkish oversight. Iran holds the longest coastline along the Persian Gulf and the strongest practical interest in keeping it secure. Granting it formal responsibility, carefully negotiated and monitored, could mirror successful models elsewhere. Yet following that route would require President Trump to distance himself from Israeli leadership and influential supporters who back the current approach. His core instincts, shaped deeply by his early mentor Roy Cohn, favor relentless pressure, complete denial of setbacks, and public declarations of success no matter the facts. Those habits served him in business and politics for decades, including through multiple bankruptcies that allowed fresh starts with new funding. In this case, the decision to strike Iran aligned with long-standing goals of certain wealthy donors who shifted support toward Trump in recent years. They viewed Iran as the primary obstacle to regional dominance. Intelligence assessments suggesting a quick collapse proved overly optimistic. Only unrealistic expectations could have counted on rapid disintegration. The human and economic costs continue mounting. Removing roughly 15 to 20 million barrels of daily oil supply from global markets creates ripples far beyond the Gulf. Australia, with almost no strategic reserves, could face diesel shortages within 2 weeks, threatening its entire economy. Similar pressures will hit refining and manufacturing worldwide. Fertilizer production, which accounts for about 35% of global supply from this region, now faces disruption. This threatens the gains of the Green Revolution that fed growing populations for generations. Even the United States, despite its own energy resources, will encounter higher food prices and potential shortages ahead. The dollar's role as the primary currency for oil trades, the petrodollar system, has underpinned American prosperity and debt financing for decades. That arrangement is now under direct challenge. Iran insists on trading in other currencies such as the yuan or rubles. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, key partners in the old system, face their own vulnerabilities. Houthi actions could target pipelines and Red Sea facilities, while major ports and refineries remain exposed. These developments were not inevitable. This conflict represents a choice pursued without formal congressional declaration or broad public debate. The emphasis from the start centered on supporting Israeli objectives rather than strictly American strategic interests. President Trump's approach reflects those three rules from Roy Cohn: keep attacking, deny problems, and claim victory constantly. Understanding this framework helps explain the public messaging, late-night statements, and optimistic projections, even when evidence points elsewhere. The recent sharing of an AI-generated image depicting him in a messianic light, followed by unusual explanations, raises legitimate questions about his current state of mind. Concerns about mental capacity are serious. The 25th Amendment offers a constitutional process for removal if the cabinet agrees, but those around him appear hesitant, living in fear of crossing him. Vice President Vance seems especially cautious. Longer term, some influential financial backers might conclude that Trump has become more liability than asset to their goals. Should that shift occur, pressure could build quickly given their sway in Congress. So far, few lawmakers have spoken forcefully against continuing the conflict or withholding funding. Most remain quiet, suggesting broad alignment with the current direction, despite growing costs. Public approval ratings have dropped sharply, and the longer the situation drags on, the greater the political damage ahead of future elections. Yet midterms may not bring fundamental change. Deep divisions exist, but many actors across the spectrum share similar incentives around self-interest and access to power. The question remains how long this phase can continue before economic realities force a reckoning. Global energy markets, food systems, and financial structures all face mounting stress from a conflict that was optional. Looking ahead, the next several days after the ceasefire ends will likely feature renewed heavy strikes on Iran. General Kane, overseeing much of the air component, thinks in terms of targets and munitions. If, after 3 or 4 days of maximum effort, there is no clear evidence of Iranian collapse, conversations inside the administration may turn seriously toward winding down direct involvement. Iran has transformed hundreds of miles beyond its borders into a defended zone through persistent surveillance, accurate targeting, and layered strike systems, both manned and unmanned. Any force entering that space can be detected, tracked, and engaged. This represents modern warfare, not the models many still reference from earlier eras. Regional dynamics add more layers of risk. Turkish leaders have emerged as a significant long-term factor with capabilities and ambitions that worry Israeli officials. Egypt faces internal pressures and public anger over events involving Palestinians. The broader hatred toward Israel across the region stands at historic highs. While no one can predict exact outcomes, the potential for wider confrontation involving multiple states remains real and dangerous. Nuclear risks hover in the background. Israel possesses such weapons, but open threats from Russia, Pakistan, and China warn against their use. No one wants escalation to that level, yet control over Israeli decision-making appears limited from the American side. The United States finds itself in a position where its actions have strengthened Iranian internal unity while failing to achieve stated military aims. Supply lines for advanced systems continue flowing to Iran despite sanctions and pressure. Meanwhile, distractions in other theaters, Ukraine, potential tensions around Taiwan, and energy shocks could encourage other powers to press advantages. China and Russia have coordinated more closely, with Moscow gaining revenue windfalls and Beijing securing alternative energy pathways. Overland routes, Caspian access, and expanded partnerships reduce the effectiveness of any naval blockade. These adaptations show the limits of traditional pressure tactics against a prepared adversary. Inside Israel, despite strong public messaging, the sustained impacts of the conflict are evident in population movements and infrastructure strain. Large-scale departures of citizens indicate the human toll. Yet the strategy pursued seems locked in, with little room for adjustment even as costs rise. For the United States, the economic consequences could reshape daily life faster than many expect. Tankers are already repositioning toward American ports to load oil, but export capacity cannot fully offset global shortfalls. Rumors in policy circles suggest possible future domestic rationing as reserves are protected. Such measures would feel unfamiliar to generations, unused to energy constraints. The fertilizer gap alone threatens harvests across continents. Combined with disrupted trade routes and higher shipping costs, this points toward inflation and scarcity in basics. These outcomes stem directly from choices made in support of one ally's maximalist goals rather than balanced national interests. President Trump's personal style makes admitting a need for diplomatic pivot difficult. His history rewards projection of strength and dismissal of setbacks. However, reality has a way of asserting itself when oil prices spike, supply chains fracture, and public patience erodes. The coming weeks will test whether another round of strikes produces different results or simply repeats the pattern of resilience on the Iranian side. Broader questions about American strategy in the region deserve examination. Relying heavily on air power and sanctions has produced mixed records historically. Underground facilities, dispersed assets, and alternative export methods blunt many of those tools. Seizing limited territory, such as islands, does little to restore insurance confidence or guarantee safe passage for tankers. The wiser course, as noted earlier, would involve multilateral talks that acknowledge geographic and economic realities in the Gulf. Iran cannot be wished away as a coastal power. Managing the strait effectively requires its participation under agreed rules. Turning away from that path risks deeper entanglement with uncertain benefits. Colonel Macgregor has long studied these patterns. His writings, including older analyses from years past, highlighted how surveillance and precision strike systems change battlefields. Iran has applied those lessons effectively, creating defensive depth that challenges assumptions of quick victory. The current trajectory carries risks, not just abroad but at home. Economic fallout from energy disruption could fuel inflation, shortages, and political backlash. Congress, having stayed largely supportive, may find itself sharing accountability when voters feel the effects in their daily lives. Calls for de-escalation through diplomacy still represent the most rational exit. Yet the personalities and incentives involved favor continuation. President Trump, Vice President Vance, and key backers remain aligned with forward-leaning policies centered on Israeli security priorities. The conversation underscores a larger pattern, interconnected global crises where actions in one theater ripple into others. Energy, finance, military posture, and alliances all interact in ways that demand clear-eyed assessment over optimistic projections. Colonel Macgregor maintains his Substack, where readers can find both recent commentary and earlier pieces examining these exact dynamics of modern conflict, persistent surveillance, and strike capabilities. His perspective draws from decades of observation and a willingness to question prevailing narratives. As this situation evolves, the central challenge remains finding a way to protect vital interests without becoming locked into open-ended commitments that deliver diminishing returns. The coming days after the ceasefire will clarify whether escalation brings breakthroughs or simply more evidence that new approaches are needed. The stakes extend far beyond any single country they touch: global stability, economic security, and the future shape of international relations. This analysis leaves little room for illusion. The conflict tests not only military capabilities, but also the ability of leaders to adapt when initial plans encounter determined resistance and complex realities. How the United States navigates the next phase will influence events for years ahead.